China, Mexico, and the fentanyl system. Why the supply chain still works. When people ask who is responsible for the fentanyl crisis, they usually want a country. China, Mexico, the United States. But fentanyl doesn't work like a flag on a map. It works like a supply chain. And supply chains don't survive because governments do nothing. They survive because governments do just enough to claim action, while avoiding the economic, political, and diplomatic costs of real intervention. Tonight, we're breaking down China's role upstream, Mexico's role in production and distribution, and why neither government has applied sustained system-breaking pressure, even though both publicly say the crisis matters. This isn't about intent, it's about incentives. The core reality: set expectations. Let's be clear up front. China has taken some action. Mexico has taken some action. But the fentanyl system is still expanding, adapting, and killing at scale. That tells us something important. What's being done is not proportional to the damage being caused. And that gap between rhetoric and impact is where this crisis lives. China: upstream power, downstream distance. 3. China's real position in the system. China is not running Mexican cartels. China is not shipping finished fentanyl at scale the way it did prior to 2019. China is the world's largest chemical producer, and fentanyl is, at its core, a chemical problem before it is a criminal one. China's role sits upstream: precursor chemicals, pre-precursors, and chemical analogs that are legal on paper and lethal in practice. That upstream position gives China enormous leverage and plausible deniability. The 2019 scheduling moment. What changed, what didn't? In 2019, China scheduled fentanyl and many analogs as controlled substances. This was widely reported as a breakthrough, and it did change things. Open online fentanyl sales dropped, direct shipments declined. But the system adapted almost immediately. Instead of fentanyl, suppliers moved one step back in the chemical chain to substances not yet scheduled or slightly modified to stay legal. This wasn't a failure of chemistry, it was a failure of regulatory speed. Why China hasn't cracked down harder. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A true crackdown would require aggressive inspections across thousands of chemical firms, deep monitoring of exports, criminal penalties that disrupt industrial output, and sustained cooperation that risks trade friction. That collides with China's priorities: economic growth, industrial dominance, and control over domestic stability. So enforcement exists, but it is selective, reactive, and narrow. Enough to say, we banned fentanyl. Not enough to say, we dismantled the chemical supply that makes it possible. That distinction matters. Why this isn't a conspiracy. This is not a state-directed poisoning campaign. There is no evidence of that. What exists instead is something more common and more dangerous: a massive legal industry, weak oversight at the margins, and criminal exploitation of gaps that are politically inconvenient to close. The system survives not because China wants Americans to die, but because stopping it completely would be costly at home. Mexico, where chemistry becomes mass death. Why Mexico became the production hub. Once precursors leave Asia, Mexico is where the fentanyl system becomes lethal. Why Mexico? Because it offers proximity to the US market, established smuggling corridors, entrenched criminal organizations, and regions where state control is contested or thin. Mexico didn't invent fentanyl, but it perfected industrialized criminal manufacturing. Cartels as manufacturers, not traffickers. This is a critical shift. Mexican cartels are no longer just moving drugs. They are synthesizing fentanyl, pressing pills, branding counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and managing quality control. This is manufacturing, and manufacturing is harder to dismantle than smuggling. Because you're not chasing a shipment, you're confronting an economic engine. Mexico's enforcement reality. Mexico absolutely conducts seizures, lab busts, arrests, and high-profile operations. But the results tell the story. Production continues. Purity remains high. Prices remain low. That means enforcement is episodic, localized, and often overwhelmed. Why? Because a sustained crackdown would require confronting cartel control in entire regions, accepting large-scale violence and political backlash, and risking institutional collapse in some areas. Mexico is managing the problem, not dismantling it. The political constraint. Every Mexican administration faces the same dilemma. Go all in on cartel dismantling and risk destabilization, mass violence, and loss of local governance. Or apply pressure just below the threshold of collapse. The result is a strategy of containment, not eradication. And containment is not enough for fentanyl. Why the system survives. Modular design. This system is modular by design. If China tightens controls, chemicals reroute through third countries. If Mexico cracks down in one state, labs move. If the US increases seizures, purity increases to compensate. Every node adapts. That's not accidental. That's supply chain logic. Everyone acts below the pain threshold. This is the shared failure. China acts, but not enough to disrupt industry. Mexico acts, but not enough to dismantle cartels. The US acts, but mostly at the border and retail end. Each government stays below its own pain threshold. The pain is exported downstream to users, families, and communities. Why cooperation hasn't solved it. International cooperation exists, but cooperation without aligned incentives is theater. China wants trade stability. Mexico wants internal stability. The US wants results without structural reform at home. Those goals conflict, so the fentanyl system continues to operate in the gaps between them. The supply chain map. From port to grave, the full chain. Let's walk the chain end to end, not tactically, not operationally, structurally. Because once you see it, the failure becomes obvious. The takeaway. This crisis does not persist because no one cares. It persists because everyone cares just enough not to break the system they rely on. China regulates chemicals, but protects industry. Mexico fights cartels, but avoids state collapse. The US fights drugs, but avoids demand reform. And fentanyl fills the space between those choices. If you want to understand fentanyl, stop asking, who is the villain? Start asking, which incentives keep this supply chain intact? Because until those incentives change, this system will keep producing death. Efficiently, quietly, and at scale. When people hear Donald Trump talk about fentanyl, they often assume the response would be the same everywhere. More pressure, more force, more threats. But when you look closely at what Trump actually did, not what he said, a much more structured pattern emerges. The same doctrine, applied very differently. To understand how the United States confronts fentanyl today, you have to compare three countries: Venezuela, China, and Mexico, because Trump did not treat them equally. The Don Roe Doctrine. Trump's approach followed a consistent escalation ladder: economic pressure first, legal designation second, isolation third, and finally, the implied or explicit threat of force. But the ceiling of that pressure depended on one question: is the target viewed as a sovereign partner, a strategic rival, or a criminal regime? That distinction mattered more than rhetoric. Venezuela. When the state becomes the target, Venezuela represents the extreme end of the spectrum. Trump did not treat Venezuela as a country failing to cooperate. He treated it as a narco-state. First came economic strangulation. U.S. sanctions cut Venezuela off from global oil markets. Its state oil company lost access to dollars. Shipping, insurance, and financial intermediaries were sanctioned. The goal was not reform, it was collapse. Then came criminalization. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted sitting Venezuelan leaders, including Nicolas Maduro, on charges of narco-terrorism. Multi-million-dollar bounties were placed on the heads of a functioning government. That is almost unheard of in modern international relations. At that point, Venezuela was no longer being treated as a sovereign equal. It was being treated like a transnational criminal organization. That happened to control territory. Finally, legitimacy was stripped. The United States recognized an alternative president, pressed allies to do the same, and increased intelligence, naval interdictions, and covert pressure. Short of a full invasion, this was maximum pressure. Venezuela shows what Trump does when he believes a regime is irredeemable. China. Pressure without breaking the system. China was different. Trump accused China of enabling the fentanyl crisis by allowing chemical precursor exports. But he did not try to collapse the Chinese state. Instead, he applied pressure with limits. Tariffs were imposed and publicly linked to fentanyl. Specific companies were sanctioned, individual actors were indicted. But there were no bounties on Chinese leaders, no indictments of the Communist Party, no recognition of an alternate government. China was treated as a strategic adversary, not a criminal regime. The goal was not to break China, it was to force compliance, while preserving global economic stability. Trump pushed, he threatened, but he never crossed the line into regime criminalization. That ceiling mattered. Mexico. Coercion without sovereignty collapse. Mexico sat somewhere in between. Trump used tariffs as leverage. He publicly blamed Mexico for fentanyl flows. He escalated border enforcement. But again, the line was clear. The Mexican government itself was never indicted. Instead, the focus shifted to cartels. Trump repeatedly floated the idea of designating Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. That matters legally, because it reframes drug trafficking as a national security threat, rather than a law enforcement problem. But even then, Trump stopped short of treating Mexico as a failed or criminal state. There was no regime change language, no parallel government, no bounties. The objective was compliance, not collapse. The juxtaposition. Put side by side, the pattern is unmistakable. With Venezuela, Trump tried to remove the regime. With China, he tried to bend the system. With Mexico, he tried to force enforcement, without breaking the relationship. Same doctrine, different ceilings, and those ceilings explain why fentanyl policy looks aggressive, but stops short of full confrontation. Why this matters. Fentanyl doesn't move because of one country. It moves because global systems are exploitable. Chemical supply chains, ports, trade corridors, financial networks. Trump's strategy targeted pressure points, but only went as far as the geopolitical risk allowed. Venezuela was expendable. China was not. Mexico was indispensable. That's reality, not rhetoric. Defined the response. Closing. So when you hear calls for tougher fentanyl enforcement, remember this: the United States does not apply pressure evenly. It applies it strategically. And history shows that. How far Washington is willing to go depends less on the drug and more on how dangerous it is to break the system that moves it.